Hi, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 9 of My Words, Our Journey. I'm your host, Monty, and today we'll start with Chapter 43. Madison did not cancel their next date. If asked, she was not sure if it was because of the fear of looking guilty of something or loneliness. It was a cool evening, and many others had had the same idea as Leonard and Madison. The movie theater was crowded and getting more so by the minute. There were not too many good movies out at the time, but there was little else to do in a small town on a cool evening. So Madison was seen by many in the community out for the first time since the disappearance of her husband, with a man that, while well dressed, clean shaven, and well mannered, was much older than she. It did not get past most that it had only been a mere few weeks since Riot had vanished from the face of the earth. Do you think that most people think I'm your uncle or your dad? Leonard finally asked with a smile. Madison had already decided what she must do. No, Leonard, I'm sorry. I should have told you last night. Technically, I'm still married until Ryan is found, or the lawyer figures out what I'm to do next. It's been a rough time. I was just hoping to be able to put it all behind me, at least for a little while. Well, young lady, considered it behind you, as far as I'm concerned. And I would have gone with old cranky uncle, just so you know. Without thought, Madison snuggled in closer to Leonard as they waited in line for tickets. She did feel safe with him, even though he could be the piece of the puzzle that put her in prison, or worse. Madison knew if she could talk to her friends and cohorts, they would not approve. They would strongly not approve. While Madison was dating, Megan was trying to clean up a loose end. The thought process had taken her only a short time. If Madison was caught, they would all spend the rest of their lives in prison, probably on death row. And if the detective woke up and contradicted Sandy, the whole plan would blow up in their faces. All they had hoped for would be lost. So, without consulting her partners, because of their circumstances, Megan decided to make sure the out of town officer did not wake up to tell his story. Once her decision was made, all Megan had to do was walk up to the upstairs bathroom and retrieve the 3 syringes, and then out to the detached garage and retrieve the antifreeze from the middle shelf where all the car supplies were stored. Stuart had never been one to pass on a sale at an auto parts store. There were tools, oil, cleaning rags, cleaning supplies, waxes, and more waxes, and just about anything else you might want to fix, clean, or just do general maintenance on an automobile. And Megan knew there would be antifreeze as well, because Stuart had threatened more than once to bring it out and leave it for the neighbor's 2 small dogs that could sometimes bark a little too much. Her thinking had been sound as far as she could tell. She knew the stranger was in a coma. She knew he'd be fed through some kind of a tube, and she figured her dead husband's old syringes — he had had to give himself shots for hyperthyroid over the years — filled with antifreeze would surely keep the man from regaining consciousness. After only a moment or two of figuring out how she could get into the hospital, Megan remembered the costume she had worn to a Halloween party the year before. Stuart had forced her into wearing a nurse's uniform that was a little too short and a little too tight, and a red wig as her costume. He had gone as a car crash victim and all night asked his fellows if they liked his hot nurse. Today, that outfit would come in handy. Megan did not know of anyone she knew that worked at the hospital on third shift, but it was a small town, and she knew there would be at least a few cameras mounted around the place. With the right makeup and the red wig, she should be unrecognizable and in and out of the hospital before anyone knew what happened. Chapter 44. As Megan took the key out of the ignition, she turned on the overhead light and took one last look at her handiwork. The makeup looked pretty good. She figured she could walk past most of her friends, and they might take a double take, but she doubted they would know who she was, at least without a closer glance. She had taken a Valium to calm her nerves before she left the house. Unfortunately, it had not taken hold until she had almost reached the hospital. The ride had not been long, but it was grueling. Megan had fought with the steering wheel the entire way. It wanted to turn her around and head straight back to the safety of her home, while she knew this must be done. The night was cool and the air felt good on her cheeks and legs. Megan had been to the hospital on numerous occasions over the years and knew the layout pretty well. Her intended target should be on the 3rd floor. It was a small town and even a smaller hospital, so it was conceivable that the detective could be the only one on the floor. Megan also knew the only waiting room was on the second floor, and she had no intention of going anywhere near there. The automatic sliding door closed behind her, and Megan headed straight for the elevator. There she stood for what seemed like an eternity, long enough for a young man to exit the men's room door and begin tossing his mop around. He was not doing a good job on the floor, but he was getting a pretty good workout, with each motion of the long line from his headphones tossed back and forth. She could not see it, but by the way he was dancing around, she knew there must be some kind of an MP3 player somewhere on his person. Their eyes met. Megan looked away. She remained calm, even while she felt the hospital worker checking her out. Megan knew he was ready to make small talk and prayed that the ding would come soon. "So are you the new girl?" Ding! Her ride arrived on cue, and her prayer was answered. Megan smiled and stepped onto the elevator. The news broke the following morning. The FBI agent from up north had passed away. Sean Trammell had died from complications. The morning news showed clips of the doctor describing how his head had hit the concrete step at just the wrong angle, causing swelling and clotting that Sean was unable to fight through, and how he had only regained consciousness for a short time, just long enough to give his family and friends hope, the reporter added for dramatic effect. Constant pictures of the hospital, Jill crying in the hallway, and the mall alley where the attack had taken place repeated on every local channel. It was awful. Maybe the most awful news the ladies could have received. None of the women knew the law well at all, but each had watched enough television to know anyone involved in killing an officer of the law got the death penalty. The stakes had been high. Now the bar had been elevated to its highest level. All wanted to get together with the others, needed to talk, needed to get some reassurance. All knew that was impossible. There had been no communication, and it would stay that way until Megan sent them a sign in the classifieds. Each would agonize with thoughts of how this would play out. Each would run through different scenarios. All would realize the death of the detective, while tragic, had helped their cause. If he had awoken and told others what had really happened, they would have surely been caught. Madison was freaking out. There was nothing she could do to take her mind off the dead officer. It was more than her being caught or going to prison or even being put to death. It was the wife that kept showing on the news. The sadness in her eyes was genuine. Hers had been one of the good ones. Madison could see the woman had truly loved her man. Would they all sit in hell one day and reflect on the decisions they had made, or was God going to be lenient on them because he knew their circumstance? The house was empty this particular day. Madison had taken 2 showers already. The first when she had awoken and went straight to a long, warm shower. The second was after she turned on the news, heard the news, threw up on her robe, and headed back to wash the smell of disgust, guilt, and shame off of herself. Megan watched the news cycle as well. The only difference, she was confused by the morning news. Just the night before, she had spoken with the man they now said was dead, and he had seemed as healthy as anyone she could have imagined who had been shot in the head. Chapter 45. When Megan exited the elevator on the 3rd floor the night previous, she had immediately been confronted by a nurse who promptly told her she had already worked 13 hours that day and was ready to leave. Megan picked up quickly that this nurse thought she was her replacement for the evening. All she had to do was listen for 5 minutes, and the nurse, without a clue, was gone. She had filled her in on the 2 patients on the floor, grabbed her coat and purse, and walked away, pecking at her cell phone, leaving the would-be killer wondering what had just happened. Mr. Bruner was in room 306 and would need to be checked on every hour to make sure he had not worked his covers off the bed. So, if he had, all she had to do was put the covers back on. At 6 in the morning, he would need his medication, which had been left in a white disposable cup next to the phone behind the nurse's station. Mr. Trammell was in room 308. He had awoken from his coma and was sleeping soundly the last time she had checked. He would need nothing until around 7:30 in the morning, and then he would be visited by his physician. Megan had been instructed just to peek in and make sure he was resting peacefully every now and again. She could not decide. Was she more surprised by the way this had played out, or by the fact that the cop was out of the coma? Toss-up, she decided. Not wanting to stay any longer than necessary, but feeling the sudden urge to use the restroom, Megan found herself down the hall and to the left, where she refreshed herself, made sure the syringes were where they were supposed to be, and headed back to work at hand. First, she had stopped by Mr. Bruner's room. His covers were off the foot of his bed, in a bunch on the floor. His room was cool, and he looked old and fragile, lying in the big bed. Finding the remote, she turned off his television, replaced the cover, and smiled as she thought about how the others were spending their night. Next, Megan pushed open the door to room 308. There was no light, no television on in his room, but she still could make out the large man sleeping soundly. Her thought had been that he would be hooked up to a feeding tube, but since he was out of the coma, that was not the case. Instead, she would have to insert the needle directly into her victim. The thought was not pleasing at all. Everything else had gone perfect so far, so it was hard for her to be upset about this one small thing. As Megan moved into the room and towards the bedside of Sean Trammell, a small table lamp came to life across the room. Megan could not help but jump as her head turned towards the light and the woman beneath the red and green blanket. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I had to move over here. Bless his heart. But he's snoring up a storm, and I figured we both needed a rest after all that had happened." Megan started to explain she was just checking in on the patient when the detective startled them both. What does a guy have to do to get a good night's sleep around here after being shot in the head? Both women smiled and apologized. After introductions and brief small talk, Sean decided he could really use a drink. A diet soft drink sounded really good for some reason. Megan was happy for the chance to exit the room and debated if she would return with the drink or bolt for the nearest door. The ready-to-leave nurse had forgotten to give Megan one very important piece of information, and now she had met the nice couple. In the end, Megan decided it would not hurt to return with the drink, make a quick excuse to get out of the room, and call it a night. If she just left, she was afraid that would put up some sort of a red flag. This way, everything should appear normal. When she returned from the vending area, Megan was surprised to see the overhead light on and Jill's chair moved up close to her husband, who was now seated upright and wide awake. "There's no rule we're breaking here, is there?" Sean smiled a smile of a man who was glad to be alive. If he only knew, Megan thought, as she crossed the room with a soda and a fresh water bottle for his wife. As she crossed the room, all of a sudden Megan felt self-conscious about the outfit and makeup she was wearing. "No rule I can think of," Megan replied. And with that, the pair insisted their nurse pull up a chair and talk. She could tell instantly they were a loving couple and just overall good people. They talked about their hometown. They talked about hers. They talked about how they were handling the current situation. And they asked how the community was handling everything. They talked for over half an hour, and Megan left the room feeling bad she had almost taken this lovely woman's husband, and good that she had failed. All she had learned that would comfort her for now was that this up and coming superstar in the crime fighting world, his wife had bragged a little, could not remember anything relevant about the night he was shot. Megan left the hospital praying that things would work out for all of them. She prayed the nice couple would leave town happy and healthy sooner rather than later, that he would not regain any memory, and she prayed this was the last hurdle they would have to endure before they could move on with their new lives. And she prayed God would forgive her for almost killing an innocent man. Chapter 46. There was going to be a funeral back in the agent's hometown, the news anchor had said, but before there was going to be a memorial service held in the town square to honor the fallen man that had come only to help their small community. The turnout was expected to be large. The locals felt like they were part of Trammell family through all the news coverage and bios that had been done recently, similar to those of the popular reality show stars. If you watch them on television continuously, over time, they become familiar, like family. And for those that wanted their 15 seconds of fame, it did not hurt that numerous cable and national cameras would be floating around the crowded area. Sandy knew right away that she would go. It was the right thing to do. Pay her respect to the dead man and pray for forgiveness. Sandy would be there no matter what. Megan was going to be there as well, but for different reasons. Megan did not want to be the only one that was not there. It was her only motivation. She had no interest in leaving the house this day. The mind can play tricks on you, though, and hers had convinced her everyone else in town would be there, and it would look bad if she wasn't. Tammy and Sharon were going to be there as well. They both hoped the group may at least get to say a few words to each other, at least make some kind of connection. And Madison? Madison was going for a totally different reason. Reasons others would not understand. Did she really? Leonard had assumed she would be there. How could she say, "No, I thought I'd stay home and paint my nails"? The idea of standing and crying along with the rest of the town for someone they had never met and someone she had killed seemed wrong on so many levels. Still, she was going, and it was probably the right thing to do for all the wrong reasons. The day was about 6 degrees cooler than normal, making it slightly uncomfortable for the rather large gathering. Madison only wore a lightweight black leather jacket, so she stood close to Leonard, who stood next to a younger man he had introduced to her. Kenny seemed to be surprised his partner had brought a date to a memorial service. This did not lighten the weirdness in the air Madison felt, engulfing her. Kenny had been cordial, however, even pleasant, once he realized she was with Leonard. They were both upset and trying to cover it up, like men do. They seemed preoccupied, too, though. Madison could not figure out exactly why. There were others struggling to figure out what was happening as well. Each had moved through the crowd, seeking out the other women just to make sure that they could make eye contact, if nothing else. And each had seen Madison with the detectives from the news. Had she turned? If so, why were they not in jail? Was she there with them, or just making nice to the person standing next to her? It was all so confusing. As each woman struggled to stay composed, inside each was fighting the battle. One side said, "Run," while the other side said, "Stay fast and don't cause a scene." The fact they could not be seen talking amongst themselves made it worse. Megan had an idea. There were restrooms on the far side of the building, not too close and not too far away. She decided to make her way that direction, hoping others would follow her lead. She was surprised when she rounded the corner and found Madison standing there smoking a cigarette. "What are you doing?" Megan asked in a tone she didn't realize until the look on Madison's face told her how it sounded. "I'm freaking out, that's what I'm doing." Madison took a long draw and watched the smoke rose above their heads. "Give me one of those and tell me what the heck you've gotten yourself into." And Madison did. And when she finished, she stood and faced her friend, hoping for some words of wisdom, something that would make it all better. But before she could speak, the others rounded the corner one by one. Everyone had gathered, and it was not what any of them expected. It was eerie somehow. Megan spoke. "Madison, go back and continue on. It's the only thing you can do. I'll tell the others quickly, and then we'll all stay on plan until this blows over and we can get on with our lives." Madison did not have to be asked twice. She could almost taste the awkwardness in her throat. Before she took 3 steps, she heard Sharon speak. "Madison, dear, no matter what happens, we owe you." And Madison turned to each woman who had nodded in agreement, each trying to form a smile the best they could. Madison turned without a word, but feeling a little bit better, and headed back to the lion's den she had fallen into. Chapter 47. Leonard and Kenny monitored the crowd the best they could without being obvious. Television crime shows often showed the criminal return to the scene, obsessed with the news about themselves, and sometimes attend the funeral of their victim. The detectives knew this happened in real life as well. There were cameras taking still photos and video cameras combing the crowd for hours of fun for the detectives to mull over later. It was a long shot. Everyone involved knew it. They also knew a killer was getting away with murder, and they could not stand by and do nothing. Kenny was not sure what Leonard was up to. The girl that accompanied him to the memorial service was attractive in a down-home kind of way. But he was here for a purpose, and she was young enough to be his daughter, Kenny imagined. Jill was speaking to the crowd, and it was a crowd none of them could have imagined or wished for. Kenny thought the gathering had even grown larger since the service began over half an hour ago. It was cool, but nice for December. You could see the breath of those that whispered among themselves and those that were just overweight and struggling to breathe after the rather long walk from the majority of the parking lot to the center of town square. Kenny was impressed with Jill and her strength. It took more than a special lady to do what she was doing. He knew very few people understood just what this day was doing to Jill. She was more than Sean's life partner. She was his best friend. Leonard and Kenny had been asked to speak, and neither accepted. There was much the pair would do for Sean and Jill. Speaking at the memorial service in front of a town of strangers was not on that list. Rather, Leonard had suggested they fill the time with added musical numbers, and in the end, all had agreed that would be acceptable. They needed the crowd to be gathered together as long as possible. They wanted the crews hidden on the perimeters to have every opportunity to get the footage of the entire crowd at different stages of the ceremony. No one knew what they would be looking for. The idea was just that, an idea that all knew needed a lot of luck and a prayer. As she stood between the two law officers, Madison was riding an emotional elevator. Seeing her friends and Sharon's kind words took her to the top floor. The realization she was a cop killer took her to the basement, and throughout her standing there, she covered every floor in between. When it was all said and done, she blamed her husband, God, society, her family, and the law. Madison was just a creation of all those things, unable to change what had happened to her in the past that brought her to this moment in time. In her mind, she was taking the ride given to her, making the best of her situation as she went along. There were those that would judge her if they found out her secret. Madison knew she needed to stop worrying about what others thought. She needed to start living for herself. And if that was for another 5 minutes or another 50 years, she was not going to look back as she had once done. When the service was over, Leonard had asked Madison if they could have dinner that evening. So as she drove home, she wondered how this part of her life would go. She did not have to marry the man, but she also didn't want to cut him off and somehow upset things. What had Megan said? Go back and continue on. It's the only thing you can do. So when Leonard had said he needed to go back to the office for a while, but wanted to see her later, she had agreed. She enjoyed his company. He was nice to her, and right now, she would take older and nicer over younger, jerky any day. The whole murder detective thing was something they could probably not get past as a long-term couple, however, she thought. Kenny was homesick. He felt guilty for how he felt. He just wanted to be home, back to his life. The small town seemed to agree with Leonard, but not Kenny. He missed the city and all it had to offer, including Rachel. He also missed his routine. Kenny maintained a certain eating, exercise, and sleep schedule, and all three had been thrown out the window of late. The funeral had affected him more than he thought it would as well. Death was one of those things that he just couldn't wrap his brain around. The whole stop breathing, buried in the ground thing puzzled him. He wondered how many hours of tapes they had waiting for them back at the police station. It had been a long shot, but at this point it was all they had. He had worked on tedious tasks before and handled them better than most. Kenny was already prepared for Leonard to bail out on him when he heard, "Would you be crushed if I only spent an hour or so looking at video? Madison wants to grab a bite later." Kenny smiled and sighed. He had heard Leonard ask the woman out. Was he trying to impress Kenny? Maybe. Kenny was okay with that. Not a problem. I'll probably make it through one or two tapes myself. I have a tendency to stop, rewind, play, and pause. Besides, if a woman that looked that good wanted to have dinner with me, I'd have blown you off after the service. There you go, old man. I threw you a bone. Kenny did not have to look over from the driver's seat. Leonard was gleaming. Chapter 48. The next morning, Kenny arrived at the hospital before 6 in the morning. He had already run 3 miles, read the morning paper, and stopped by the precinct to pick up the box of tapes and pics. There was still half of the videos to go through, and this morning he would have a fresh set of eyes to help in the process. As he walked into the room, he saw Jill curled up in the corner with a small hospital blanket over her shoulder. There was no way she was comfortable, but he doubted she ever complained about anything. He was watching her as she began to stir. "Are you going to stare at my wife? Or are you here to see me?" Sean asked as Kenny turned with a start. Kenny had been startled by the voice, not by the fact that it was Sean. It was all part of their plan, actually. When Sean had come out of his coma, and the trio had had time to talk things over, it seemed to be the one, if not the only option they had. Now they would review the film taken from the funeral in hopes they would catch a break they so desperately needed. The local authorities had brought in a video player the night before, and 2 chairs were placed next to Sean's bed. Kenny had brought the coffee from downstairs. "I don't know if I'm supposed to have coffee, but give me one of those anyway," Sean whispered to his friend. Jill turned away from the commotion and pulled her legs in tight. 10 minutes into the tape, the still tired Leonard entered the room, said his hellos, and took his seat and warm coffee. There was no need to worry about the volume. The department was not equipped with the latest technology, and therefore they had not been able to record sound other than what an everyday camcorder would pick up. And at the distances recorders had been placed, it was impossible to hear anything but the faint sounds of a memorial service and the breathing of the police officers manning the equipment. It was not until the 4th tape and a fresh round of coffee that they found something of interest. A camera had picked up a group of women gathered by the bathrooms, a group of women that catches each of their attention. Leonard watched for the second time as Madison began speaking to the first, and then as the others gathered in the group. Leonard paused the tape, freezing the group on the television screen. When Leonard had finished telling Sean about his relationship with Madison, Sean asked Kenny to retrieve his briefcase from the foot of the bed. When Sean turned on the lamp next to him and opened the file, he slowly removed photo after photo and handed them to Kenny, who glanced at them and passed them on to Leonard. Each of the women in the photo matched the face on the screen. Gentlemen, we are looking at each of the women who lost their husbands to the serial killer, plus Madison Carver, whose husband is still missing. The words even chilled Sean as he spoke them. They watched the tape several more times and could see the women's mouths moving, but were unable to make out any of the conversation. It was important to the case, each of them could feel it within their bones. Leonard could not believe what he had seen, but tried to think positively while his opportunity for happiness seemed to be slipping away. We need to find a lip reader or a deaf person who can tell us what they're saying, Leonard spoke words without emotion. Some of them have their back turned to the camera. But you're right. We need to be able to at least get parts of the conversation. I'm on it. And with that, Kenny was out the door without another word. Sean readjusted his pillow and looked at Leonard. Are you going to be all right, no matter what happens with this? Chapter 49. Leonard did not have an answer for Sean. All he could do was think about the night before, how wonderful he had felt, how content he thought he could be in this small town, and now all that had been taken away from him. The night prior. They had gone to Main Street Diner for dinner. She looked lovely, and Leonard found himself having feelings for her. They had talked about past relationships, his daughter, her husband, his retirement, and her future career choices. They had talked until the restaurant was empty, the staff done with their checklists for the night, and the manager ready to go home to his family. And then they walked down the quiet street holding hands. Leonard was unsure who had made the first move, but it didn't matter. It just felt right for them to be having such a nice evening. Leonard thought he could sense Madison felt the same. She was more relaxed, comfortable. Leaving his rental in the parking lot, they walked a mile and a quarter back to Madison's sister's home on a cool and dark night. However, Leonard knew she did not expect him to walk back to his car. Somehow he knew they would spend the night in each other's arms. And how good his arms had felt wrapped around her. They had entered through the garage to a furnished basement that featured a wet bar, floor model television, old but level pool table, and carpet that was clean but clearly from a different era, and of course a pull-out sofa built just for two. Not a word was spoken as she lit 3 candles on the bar, then moved around to the left side of the sofa. There were 3 pillows and a large black down comforter on the bed. Had she planned it? Or did she always leave candles and sofa ready for strangers? Strangers. They were strangers, weren't they? They had known each other for such a short time. Leonard had held her all night, neither stirring until they heard the movement of the family upstairs. The image made Leonard smile, even with the current realizations. Madison had surprised him by taking his hand and leading him upstairs. When they were there, she introduced him as her friend, fixed them both a bowl of oatmeal, toast, and orange juice, then took a seat and talked with her family and Leonard like they had been doing this for years. Leonard had been happy for the first time in a long time. John watched his friend struggle with his emotions. It was not something he was comfortable with, but his intuition, though impaired by drugs, told him Leonard had strong feelings for this woman and that he was going to take a huge fall. Was there a simpler answer to why they were conveniently gathered together? Or had one of these women put him in the hospital, put Jill through the sleepless nights and stress of faking a death? As the questions chased one another around in his head, Sean laid back and closed his eyes. He and Leonard were mere feet from each other, but could not have been further apart. Kenley had only gone down the hall, up 2 flights of stairs, and around a corner where he found the office he needed. Amy Greener was sitting at her desk when he entered her small but encluttered space. "Hi, my name is Kenny Costco, and I need your help if you have a few minutes." As Kenny explained that a nurse had pointed him in her direction, who he was, and what he needed, he felt Miss Greer looking him over. Kenny knew he was better than average looking, and he took pride in his appearance. So it wasn't the first time he had caught a woman checking him out. The problem in this case, however, was twofold. Amy was better than average looking herself, and Kenny was on a mission. Even before he finished his request, Amy stood and moved around her desk. "I have a few minutes for an officer of the law." As they walked down the hallway towards the elevator, Kenny thought about Rachel and where they were in their relationship. Would he be doing anything wrong to flirt with this beauty? When we're done, would you like to grab a cup of coffee? She knew she was attractive, and Kenny guessed she had not heard the word no very often. He tried, but could not contain the silly grin that wanted to appear on his face. Sure, that'd be great. He'd figure out the doing something wrong thing later, he thought. As they entered the hospital room, Kenny noticed the lights were all turned on, Jill was gone, and Sean and Leonard were lost in their own thoughts. Amy would be fixing that right away. And with that, we'll conclude today's episode. I really want to thank each of you that have taken time out of your day to join me on this journey. Special shout out to our listeners in Rwanda. Thank you to each of you again, and have a great day.